Well, as I start the message here today, I was thinking of a couple of things, and one of the things that came to mind as I started to study the passage for today's message, about a month ago, I had a really unique opportunity that I had never had before, a new experience for me for sure. I had the opportunity to go downtown to the federal courthouse and witness a naturalization ceremony. I don't know if anybody's seen that before. It was really, really cool. And I was there for a particular person because there's an awesome guy in our church, a young Hungarian man named Levi Nagy. Many of you know Levi. They've been part of our church since we started 5 years ago. And Levi was becoming a U.S. citizen about roughly a month ago. And there was this ceremony downtown at the federal courthouse, and I believe there were 23 people that became citizens in that ceremony. Levi was one of them, and I think they represented 16 different countries, those 23 folks. And it was really, really cool. Now, Levi and Heidi are sick today, so they're not in the room. If they were in the room, I'd have you cheer them on a little bit. But since they're not, let me just tell you that next time you see Levi, be sure to greet him as your fellow American, all right? Because he's been doing that since, and so he would get a kick out of that if you said something about being a fellow American. It was really, really cool. It was inspiring and encouraging, and it was neat to see that whole thing because I've known Levi for the past 5 years, and Levi has been putting in a lot of hard work these past 5 years to become a citizen. In my opinion, they make that process entirely too difficult. I'm quite sure that most of us in the room would not be able to pass the test that they have to pass to become a citizen. But anyways, it was really cool. So congratulations to Levi. Well, during that ceremony, there's a lot of patriotic kind of things going on at the ceremony. It was great. It was really cool. And one of the things that we participated in, as you can imagine, is at one point we all stood up and the flag came in and we all recited the Pledge of Allegiance together. And how cool is that to see these 23 new citizens recite the Pledge of Allegiance as well? It's very, very cool. Well, after that ceremony, then, I was studying for the message, and I had been thinking about the Pledge of Allegiance because I haven't recited the Pledge of Allegiance in quite some time, but I still remembered all the words of the pledge. And so I was thinking about the Pledge of Allegiance. It was kind of rolling over in my head for a week or two. And I was thinking of that famous line that as Christians we appreciate, that famous line in the pledge that just says, under God, one nation under God. So I was thinking about that. I didn't know this, but I later learned that the Pledge of Allegiance was created after the Civil War, but the original version of the pledge did not include that line, under God. It wasn't until 1954 that the phrase under God was added to our Pledge of Allegiance in our country. And so I found myself just reflecting on that line from the pledge, under God. And I wondered, is that still true? Is that still true of our nation, that we are one nation under God? I don't really have a good answer for you, but I wondered about that, and we should wonder about that. I mean, do we still, the majority of our citizens, do we still have a national desire to be one nation under God? I mean, how do we define God? You probably get a lot of different answers, of course, if you ask people that. Do the majority of our citizens believe America is still one nation under God? What's that even mean, to be a nation under God? Can a nation be primarily one nation under God? Well, I don't have a great answer for you on that particular question, but that could serve as a lively discussion for lunch today. I will say a couple of things, though. On the one hand, every nation, whether they realize it or not, is, in some sense, under God. because the one true God, the triune God of the Bible, is, whether you agree with it or not, God is sovereignly in control over all nations, whether you realize it or agree with it or not. So in one sense, every nation, tribe, and tongue is under God. But on the other hand, I think a strong case could be made that the majority of the citizens in America and our culture at large, certainly our entertainment industry, I think even our political leaders on both sides of the aisle, many are ungodly. Majority of the citizens in America are ungodly. And what I mean by that is they're not sincerely following Jesus, the triune God of the Bible. And so maybe this isn't what it means, but if under God means that a person or a nation is primarily, at least, committed to the supremacy of the triune God of the Bible, if that's what it means, well, then I am quite sure that statement does not accurately reflect the majority of our population or our leadership. You can disagree with me on that. That's really not what the message is even about. Now, before anybody runs for the door or something, no, Andy is not against the Pledge of Allegiance. I know the Pledge of Allegiance. I recite it when I'm in that kind of opportunity. I'm all for it. It's great. Let's keep reciting it. I think it's great. Let's keep that phrase, under God, if we can. I mean, that's great. That's fine. And maybe most importantly, I long for myself to be truly one man and individual that is fully surrendered to Jesus, a man that is under God. I hope that you hope that for yourself. And I long for our nation to be truly under God. I'm just not so sure that it is. Here's what I'm getting at, and here's how it ties into a message today. The reality is we do live in a pagan, anti-God of the Bible. If you want to call it a post-Christian culture, you certainly could. Now, set aside a discussion of the Pledge of Allegiance, our nation is very ungodly in a multitude of ways. We probably all would be in agreement with that. And so that means that genuine Christians, genuine Christians, and there's a lot of hypocritical folks that call themselves Christians, but genuine Christians who are living in an ungodly society such as ours, we're going to stand out. We're just going to stand out. At some point, a genuine Christian's going to stand out in a society such as ours. Our Christian witness ought to be distinct in such a society. Well, today, and I meant to start the message with just a little bit of tension, so that's great if you're feeling a little bit of tension. Today, we're starting a new series where we're going to study through a phenomenal Old Testament book, the book of Daniel. And it's such an incredible book in the Old Testament. I'm so excited to share it with you. We're going to take 13 sermons to work our way through the book of Daniel. Now, today's message might feel a little bit more like a Bible class than a sermon, and that's on purpose. I'm going to give you kind of an introduction to the book of Daniel and hopefully get our minds kind of wrapped around the book of Daniel, and today's message will serve as sort of a foundation as we begin to work our way through the book of Daniel. We are 2,600 years removed from the events recorded in the book of Daniel. And the interesting thing, though, is that I think you'll find we have a lot more similarities with the book of Daniel than we might think. Now, there's certainly lots and lots of differences, and you'll see those differences as we go throughout the study. But there's many similarities between our context and ancient Babylonia 2,600 years ago. Because in the book of Daniel, what we find is Daniel this godly young man at the beginning, old man at the end of the book, this godly man, Daniel, finds himself living in a deeply pagan environment known as ancient Babylon. Lots of similarities. We are, in some sense, living in a modern-day Babylon. Now, I know it's a lot different. I know it's so different. But it's interesting that the Bible treats the word Babylon as synonymous with the words worldly and ungodliness. And so in a very real way, I know our country's much different than Babylon, but in some ways, we are living in modern day Babylon, i.e. an ungodly kind of culture in society. That's just the way it is. It's just the way it is. I don't want it to be that way, but that's the way it is. And so there's a lot that we can learn from the book of Daniel. And I think we'll find a lot more points of connection in our situation than we might realize. So the big idea for today's message is this: despite present appearances, God rules and is building an everlasting kingdom. We're going to keep coming back to that statement throughout the series. So our context is undoubtedly different than Daniel's context, but it seems like ungodliness rules the day in 2025. Even in our nation that is supposedly a nation under God. But while it may seem like ungodliness and worldliness and the devil rules the day, what we learn in Daniel is that no, actually, God is firmly in control. And he is building his eternal kingdom. We're going to see that in the book of Daniel. Our main scripture today is Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. So most of this series will cover a whole chapter each week. So it'll be pretty simple. Next Sunday we'll cover the entirety of Daniel 1, and then it'll be 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way through Daniel chapter 12. But today I want to spend some extra time talking about background and introduction. So we're only going to cover 2 verses today, and then the rest of the series we'll cover an entire chapter. Now, to understand, every time we study the Bible, we have to understand context and background. If you don't understand those things, you're hopeless in terms of making an accurate application to our everyday lives. So let's talk about some background information for the book of Daniel. So the guy, Daniel, is most likely the author of this book. The content of the book of Daniel comes from or spans the time frame of 605 BC to 536 BC, roughly. Essentially, the book of Daniel covers the period of history known as the Babylonian exile, and we'll talk more about that throughout the series. The guy Daniel has historically been regarded as a major prophet, okay? The Jews looked at that a little bit differently, though Daniel has always been included in the Jewish canon of Scripture as well. The Jews didn't really regard Daniel as a prophet per se, because he wasn't really a traditional prophet, but Christians have always regarded Daniel to be a major prophet for a couple of reasons. One, because the book of Daniel contains multiple prophecies, as we'll see throughout this series, but probably primarily because Jesus refers to Daniel as a prophet in the Olivet Discourse from Matthew chapter 24 in the New Testament. Now, the first half of the book of Daniel, the first 6 chapters, are really familiar to us and exciting. You'll enjoy these chapters as we go through. Hopefully you'll enjoy all of it. But the first 6 chapters are really well known because here we find these just beloved stories that you may have grew up in if you grew up going to church or Sunday school. Stories like Daniel in the lion's den and the fiery furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or the VeggieTale versions of that story, all of that kind of thing. And so I heard one Bible teacher refer to the first 6 chapters of Daniel as the Sunday School 6. I thought that was pretty good. And it's pretty true, because these 6 chapters contain just some incredible stories that you may have grown up hearing and learning in Bible school. Really good stuff. The second half of Daniel, though, is equally good, but unfortunately often avoided, because it's much more challenging. It's much more challenging because it deals with prophecy. Now, some of that prophecy has already been fulfilled. Some parts are yet to be fulfilled, and so we'll work through those sections when we get there. But we're not gonna just cover the 6 easy chapters. We're gonna cover the whole thing, and so hopefully it will be really beneficial to you. I think that it will. Now, before we examine the first 2 verses, I want to do something a little bit different today, and I want to give you a really basic Old Testament timeline of events so that you can kind of just grasp the timeline of the Old Testament and where the events of Daniel fit into the overall story of the Old Testament. Now, I'm just giving you a really, really basic timeline today. If you have a study Bible, I would encourage you sometime this week to open up to, you'll find a timeline, probably the first 10 or 15 pages of your study Bible. You'll find a timeline that is way more detailed than what I'm going to give you today. And I would really encourage you to check that out. Especially when you start reading a new book of the Bible, look at that timeline and wrap your mind, especially in the Old Testament, try to wrap your mind around, okay, where is this happening in the overall flow of Old Testament events? The more you can understand this Old Testament timeline, I think the more you'll be able to understand what's going on in the book. And that's certainly true in the book of Daniel. So everybody grab your bulletin and put it up in the air. Everybody should have one, hopefully. Put it up in the air. Now grab a pen on the back of the seat in front of you as well. There should be pens nearby. Grab a pen as well. We're going to sail through this timeline, and I'm going to tell you to circle a couple different events that are really important and really helpful to understand in context with the book of Daniel, and I'll probably have you write something down as well. So let's just sail through this timeline, wrap our mind around Old Testament history. Everybody ready? Say ready. Ready. Here we go. Event number 1, creation. All right, Genesis chapter 1 and 2. God created the world, and God created people in his image. All right, event number 1. Event number 2, we messed everything up. All right, the fall of humanity. Genesis chapter 3. Humanity, like Adam and Eve, they rebel against God, and the problem of sin enters the world. Every human born after Adam and Eve, except for Jesus, we receive an inherited sin nature because of the fall. We've messed everything up in our rebellion against God. Event number 3 is the flood. All right, think Noah and the ark. Genesis chapter 6 through 9. God sends his just judgment upon the evil world, sparing only Noah and his family in the ark. The ark is a big, gigantic boat. Everybody thought, I'm sure must have thought, Noah was absolutely nuts. Event number 4, Babel, like the Tower of Babel. Genesis chapter 11. Humanity, again, we haven't learned our lesson. Humanity, again, rebels against God. They try to make their name great, make their way to God. And so God confuses their language and ultimately scatters humanity because their language has now been confused. Babel is possibly the original site of the future city of Babylon, which will be important when we come to the book of Daniel during the exile. Event number 5. All right, patriarchs. Everybody say patriarchs. All right, go ahead and circle that, if you will. Circle patriarchs. Now, all these events are important, but some of them are more helpful to understand than others for our context today. We read about the patriarchs in Genesis chapter 12 through 50. The patriarchs are 3 guys. Abraham, you've heard of him before. Abraham's son Isaac, and Isaac's son Jacob. Jacob's name gets changed to what? Israel. Yep. And the 12 sons of Jacob, who becomes Israel, the 12 sons of Jacob become the tribes of Israel eventually. Now, the family of Abraham is crucial for us to just know who they are and what they do, how they function, because their descendants become the nation of Israel, 12 tribes of Israel. And God planned to bless the world through the nation of Israel. Most notably, God blessed the world by bringing the Messiah, Jesus, from the nation of Israel. All right, so patriarchs, that's really, really important. If you don't understand the family of Israel, you won't understand the Old Testament at all, really. Event number 6, slavery. Israel was enslaved in Egypt for roughly 400 years. They end up there with Joseph, if you remember that story. They're there for 400 years in slavery. Event number 7 is exit or Exodus. Think book of Exodus. God raises up Moses to lead his people Israel out of Egypt immediately into the promised land. However, we know that did not happen immediately because of their sin and disobedience. Event number 8 is the law. The law. So God, after they leave Egypt, God gives Israel on Mount Sinai. He gives them instructions for worship and holy living, instructions for the tabernacle, which is like a fancy tent. Eventually that becomes the temple. And God gives them these instructions for worship so that they can fellowship with God. We talked about that a lot, by the way, in our Hebrews series that we just finished. Event number 9 is conquest. Everybody say conquest. All right, circle conquest. You could also write Canaan if you wanted to. Conquest or Canaan. After Israel wanders in the desert wilderness for 40 years, because of their disobedience, by the way, an entire generation had to die off because they were disobedient, lacked faith that God would bring them in. Well, after that, God brings the whole nation of Israel across the Jordan River into the promised land, the land of Canaan, and they're led under the leadership of Joshua after the death of Moses. And that's really important because they occupy and settle in the promised land. Every tribe has their chunk of land, and they settle in the promised land. Event number 10 is Judges, all right? For several hundred years after entering the promised land, God led Israel as their king. And during that period of time, you have various leaders that emerge known as judges that provide leadership at various points in their history at that time. And then event number 11 is the monarchy. Everybody say monarchy. All right. Circle this one as well because it's really important. Otherwise known as the United Kingdom. Now, this is not the same United Kingdom that we think of when we say the UK. It's much different, much older. The monarchy is when Israel had a king and they were united, all 12 tribes for the most part, were united as one nation under one king. All right? Now, this was actually a bad thing. It was bad because Israel rejected God as their king. And if you remember the story, you remember that they actually asked God to be ruled by a human king, which is the way the surrounding pagan nations were governed. And so God gave them what they want. He gave them kings, and it did not turn out very well, I'll say that. But the first 3 kings for this united kingdom are King Saul, then King David. Jesus, the Messiah, eventually comes from the line of David, you remember, and then David's son, King Solomon. And then event number 12 is the divided kingdom, all right? Because of Israel's sin, God divides the tribes of Israel into 2 different kingdoms. We've got a kingdom in the north and a kingdom in the south. The kingdom in the north is referred to for the rest of the Old Testament as Israel. They're the northern kingdom, and they're made up of 10 tribes of Israel. And I'll say that the northern kingdom is always evil after the split. All of the kings of the northern kingdom, all of them are evil after the split. The southern kingdom is referred to as Judah for the remainder of the Old Testament after the split. And sometimes after the northern kingdom doesn't exist, the word Israel is just referring to either all or even sometimes just the southern kingdom. But the southern kingdom is often referred to as just Judah. That southern kingdom is made up of two tribes, most notably Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. Now we come to where we're at in the book of Daniel. Event number 13 is the exile. Everybody say exile. Circle exile. So both kingdoms are exiled, but the northern kingdom is exiled before the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom, Israel, was exiled by the Assyrians in roughly 722 BC. And then roughly 120 years later, the southern kingdom, Judah, was exiled by the Babylonians from 605 to 586 BC, because it took about 20 years for that entire exile and deportation to happen, all right? And this is where the book of Daniel comes in. So write Daniel next to the word exile, okay? Because that's where Daniel happens, is during the Babylonian exile. The Babylonian exile lasted approximately 70 years. Daniel was a teenager, like probably 15 years old. He was a teenager at the beginning of the exile, and we'll look at that in all of chapter 1 next week. At the end of the exile, Daniel is in his 80s, all right? So the life of Daniel and the book of Daniel cover pretty much the whole 70-year Babylonian exile. And then the final event is restoration. Everybody say restoration. So a remnant of Jews, not all of them, in fact the majority of them stay in Babylon, but a remnant of Jews returns to Jerusalem, which had been destroyed by the Babylonians. The temple had been destroyed as well. The wall was destroyed. It was all destroyed. Well, a remnant returns. They eventually rebuild the city of Jerusalem. They rebuild the temple. They restore worship. And Jerusalem is restored as a community of worship, but they are not restored as a military power, all right? And even when we begin reading in the New Testament, we find that they are not a military power at that point. Rome is the military power at that point. And the temple was restored in roughly 516 BC. All right, everybody breathe. I don't think anybody's asleep. I am so proud of you. Now, a couple of reasons I share all that information. First reason is because I think that timeline will really help us understand the Old Testament much, much better. It really will. Even just a basic understanding of it. But also, as we study the book of Daniel, we have to begin to grapple with the sense of loss that the Jews would have felt during the Babylonian exile. I mean, much of the Old Testament history focused on the Promised Land and entering the Promised Land and settling in the Promised Land and conquering the Promised Land. Well, they had done that. Much of Old Testament history focuses on the people of God worshiping Him in a temple in Jerusalem. But then the exile comes as a consequence for their sin and unfaithfulness. And we have to understand that the exile would have been utterly devastating for the people of God. Absolutely devastating. Because the way they thought about the temple was just so much different than the way we think about a church building today. I mean, church buildings come and go. It's just a building. But the temple, the Old Testament temple, that was where the presence of God dwelled. And it was destroyed. And they were kicked out of their land and brought into a pagan nation. It would have been devastating. Now, there's no doubt that the people of God at that time would have felt abandoned by God as these ungodly, vile, pagan Babylonians conquered them. In fact, the prophet Jeremiah really grapples with this. It's like, how could you use the Babylonians? How could you use them to conquer your people? I mean, I understand how sinful we are, but how could you use them? Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed, and they were exiled to Babylon. And that's where we enter Daniel chapter 1. So if you have a Bible, turn to Daniel chapter 1. Daniel comes right after the prophet Ezekiel, right before the minor prophet Hosea. Daniel 1, verse 1 says this: In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Now, Jehoiakim, we're not going to read much about him in the book, but Jehoiakim was one of the last kings of Judah. And he was a wicked, evil king of Judah, but he was the son of King Josiah, and King Josiah was the last good, godly king in Judah. Babylon became a world power, and Babylon conquers Judah over roughly 20 years. And there were 3 separate deportations of the Jews. The first one happens in 605. That's when Daniel and his 3 friends are taken to Babylon, as we'll see next Sunday. The final deportation happens in 586 BC, and that's when the city of Jerusalem and the temple in Jerusalem are destroyed. Now, verse 2. Nebuchadnezzar thinks he's in power. He was a world power, a terribly evil, vile leader. He thinks he's in power. Then we read this in verse 2. And the Lord, not Nebuchadnezzar, and the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, that is, into Nebuchadnezzar's hand, along with some of the articles. These would be like articles used in temple worship. Along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. So in verse 2, what we learn here is who's really behind the exile, and it's not Nebuchadnezzar. The Jews probably thought that it was Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar definitely thought that he was the man with all the power. In some sense, he was. But no, what we learn is that God delivered, or in other words, God gave his people Israel into the hands of the Babylonians. The Babylonians were merely a pawn in God's grand chessboard. Now, there's 3 quick lessons I want to leave you with today, and then we're going to come back to chapter 1, and we're going to study the whole thing next Sunday. So I'd encourage you to read all of chapter 1 before next Sunday. Lesson number 1, despite present appearances, God rules and is building an everlasting kingdom. Now, you've heard me say that already. It was our big idea already. And really, it's the theme of the book of Daniel that we'll come back to throughout this series. Daniel and his 3 friends, and eventually the nation of Judah, they're taken into godless Babylon. I mean, they would have felt like God had abandoned them and that the godless Babylonians had triumphed over the God of Israel. But that's not the whole story. And we'll see it throughout the book of Daniel, but we see it already in verse 2. No, God delivered them into Nebuchadnezzar's hands. God is firmly in control. God is orchestrating world events as he still does today, and he teaches his people as he sovereignly builds his eternal kingdom. God's in control. In fact, we learn this from the prophet Jeremiah. In Jeremiah 25, verse 8 through 12, I want to share this with you quickly because it's an incredible passage. We learn that God is doing exactly what he said he would do. Jeremiah 25. Therefore, the Lord Almighty says this: because you have not listened to my words, I will summon all the peoples of the north and my servant Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. That was news to Nebuchadnezzar that he was God's servant. Declares the Lord, and I will bring them against this land and its inhabitants and against all the surrounding nations. I will completely destroy them, Israel, and make them an object of horror and scorn and an everlasting ruin. I will banish from them the sounds of joy and gladness, the voices of bride and bridegroom, the sound of millstones and the light of the lamp. This whole country will become a desolate wasteland, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. That's precisely what happened. But when the 70 years are fulfilled, I will punish the king of Babylon and his nation, the land of the Babylonians, for their guilt, declares the Lord, and I will make it desolate forever. And that's precisely what happened. And let me just say that surely, for Daniel and his friends and the believers in that day, the ones that were faithful to the Lord, surely to them, it did not feel like God was in control. I mean, this is when Jeremiah writes Lamentations, a funeral song for a city. Sure didn't feel like God was in control. And even today in 2025, while we might feel like godlessness dominates our world, and in many ways it does, the devil does not rule the day. He doesn't. God is sovereignly in control today, just as much as he was in Daniel's day, though it didn't look like it or feel like it. Second lesson. Sometimes God lovingly disciplines his people in order to restore them. This must have been hard to take. This must have been hard to take for the people of God. But the covenant that they had entered into with God included blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience. And the Lord was long-suffering. Man, he was patient with the people of Israel for hundreds, literally hundreds of years in light of their rebellion and their sin. But the time has come for God to punish his people Israel for their sin and disobedience. But God's not done with Israel. And we see that in the book of Daniel. God's not done with Israel. He's got a plan for his people. And there's a remnant of the people of God that truly want to be faithful to the Lord. And God's going to teach them a lesson, but it's going to be a hard lesson for them to learn. And they're going to learn that lesson in captivity in Babylon. So it's a hard lesson to learn. And likewise, and by the way, God was being compassionate as he taught them that lesson. All right? He was being compassionate, though I'm sure it didn't feel like it at the moment. And likewise, in our day, the people of God, we do and we will experience a wide variety of oppression and difficulty in our lives and suffering for a wide variety of reasons. I'm not giving you a simple answer to difficulty and suffering in today's message. And I'll just say that while God does not cause every difficulty in world history or in your history, he is sovereignly, providentially at work, building his eternal kingdom. And he will use everything in our lives for his glory. And we see that in the book of Daniel. And we see the Lord lovingly, providentially guiding his people back into a restored relationship with him, most notably through the gift of his son, Jesus. Lesson number 3. God's presence is inescapable. God's presence is inescapable. Now, this might not mean very much to me or to us, because we understand that God's presence is everywhere, but that's not how the Jews thought, okay? They understood that the presence of God dwelled in the temple, in the Holy of Holies, behind the curtain, like at the mercy seat. They knew that about the presence of God, but now it's all been destroyed. And they're in a different land far away from the temple. The temple's in ruins. They're off in a godless country, slaves to these godless pagans. How could God be here? Nebuchadnezzar aimed to demoralize Israel And the God of Israel, by stealing the religious articles used in worship from the temple, he stole those articles and he brought them to his pagan false god temples in Babylon. He did that to demoralize the Israelites, and it worked. I mean, that action would have been reprehensible to Israel, demoralizing. And I tell you what, Nebuchadnezzar, he probably believed that his gods, he believed in many gods, he probably believed that his many gods had triumphed over the God of Israel. That's for sure what he thought. But throughout the book of Daniel, we see quite the opposite. We see that the presence of God is at work in Babylon, because the presence of God is inescapable. The presence of God is at work in Babylon beyond the walls of Jerusalem and the temple. God was at work among them, as God is at work in us today. God's here with us right now. And God was with Daniel and his three friends, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, who become Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. God was with them during the darkest of times. Because despite present appearances, God rules. And he is building an everlasting kingdom. Bow your heads with me. The worship team is going to come lead us in a closing song. And I just invite you into a posture of prayer and reflection. You know, like Daniel, we find ourselves in seasons of pain and difficulty at times. And we find ourselves in seasons of oppression, seasons of depression, physical ailments, relational turmoil, difficulty at work or school, various sufferings of all kinds, and we find ourselves in an increasingly worldly, godless society. Now, I'd love that to change. I don't think it's going to change, to be honest with you. I'd love that to change. But the reality is we live in a pagan society right now. And sometimes we may be prone to thinking that, man, God just, how could he do anything in our midst? But man, he's at work. And just think about it on a personal level for a moment today. I don't know what you might be going through, the suffering that you are wrestling with, and I know that there's a lot of suffering represented in this room. I know that. And you might be wondering, well, where is God in that? And I've got no easy answers for you today. I don't, but I do know that, man, God loves you, and he is present in our pain, and we can turn to him, trusting him, placing our faith in him, and he'll help us. And somehow he'll use those difficult circumstances, regardless of where they've come from. He'll use them for our benefit, for his glory, and for the advancement of his kingdom. So, how do we respond? Well, we respond in a couple of ways, and we'll see this in the book of Daniel. One, the book of Daniel calls us to a quiet, steady trust in our great sovereign God who is in control. So this is a calling to trust in him despite our circumstances. And secondly, God's people in the book of Daniel are called to live distinctively, lives of obedience that will be in stark contrast to the pagan society we find ourselves living in. And so I encourage you to invite the Lord to speak to you regarding what your life of distinctiveness ought to look like as you find yourself among family and friends and coworkers that no doubt are far from God. God's placed you there for such a time as this, as he placed Daniel. And I know he'll be with us as we trust him. So let's just take some time to pray, to invite the Lord to speak to us.